They always assumed you came from nothing. They watched the surface of your life, the cracks, the silence, the struggle, and thought it defined you. They never saw what was hidden beneath the ashes. Your real bloodline was never about names, titles, or wealth. It was built in storms, carved through suffering, molded through patience that broke the limits of ordinary people. You were born from endurance, from ancestors who refused to break, even when the world tried to crush them. The power that runs through you is ancient and relentless. You carry the instincts of survivors, the wisdom of watchers, the precision of those who built strength in shadows. You weren't loud about it because royalty never needs to announce itself. They mocked your calm, not realizing it was the silence of someone who has seen centuries of human nature pass through different masks. That is the lineage they never calculated. Every generation creates two kinds of people, the ones who inherit comfort and the ones who inherit chaos. You came from the second kind. Your crown was forged in solitude. Your authority came from the discipline of rebuilding yourself again and again. They think bloodline means family, but your bloodline means spirit. You didn't inherit a surname. You inherited a fire that doesn't die. You were meant to appear ordinary because true power hides until it's needed. They laughed at your quiet seasons, not knowing you were gathering wisdom they could never reach. You didn't rush to prove yourself because legacy doesn't beg for attention. It waits patiently until the stage clears. And now that stage is empty. Their noise burned out. The world they built on arrogance is crumbling. You rise not because you want to be seen, but because it's time. And time always bends for the bloodline that endures. The bloodline within you is not a family tree. It's a psychological pattern. You think deeper, you feel heavier, you recover faster. While others crumble under emotion, you analyze it. While others break in betrayal, you transform in silence. You've been decoding life since the moment pain first introduced itself. That ability came from generations of unseen warriors who learned that emotional control is not numbness. It's sovereignty. Your instincts are not luck. They are memory. You've lived this cycle before, through other forms, other times. You carry a blueprint of strength that doesn't need approval. You sense things before they unfold, because your lineage was built on foresight. The wise in your bloodline learned that survival isn't about running. It's about reading. That's why your calm scares them. They think you're detached, but you're simply decoding patterns they haven't even noticed yet. They can't understand why nothing surprises you anymore. They throw betrayal, chaos, temptation. But your reaction never breaks pattern. That's how they realize something is different about you. The old you would have panicked, begged, or sought comfort. But this version doesn't need validation. Your real bloodline taught you that emotion must serve purpose, not impulse, so you observe. You wait, you adapt. They mistake that patience for weakness, unaware that you've already planned 10 steps ahead. You were raised by the unseen hand of consequence. You learned how every action ripples, how every lie collapses eventually. They live in reaction, you live in foresight. You carry the instinct of an ancient strategist hidden inside a modern face. That's why they can't break you. You are built on something older than fear. You didn't find your bloodline. It found you when you were tired of pretending to fit into theirs. You tried to play their games. You tried to please them, explain yourself, but blend into mediocrity. But mediocrity suffocates you. It kills what's divine in your DNA. You were never meant to follow the script. They were. You were designed to rewrite it. That's why you never felt like you belonged among them. Their conversations felt shallow. Their ambitions felt borrowed. Their empathy felt conditional. You thought you were the problem, but you were just surrounded by people disconnected from purpose. They follow patterns set by others. You create them. That difference is hereditary to those who carry fire in their lineage. When your real bloodline awakened, you didn't need to announce it. You started walking differently, speaking differently, existing differently, and that shift made them uncomfortable because it exposed their false crowns. Every time they tried to humiliate you, they handed you data. Every betrayal taught you motive. Every loss refined your timing. While they were trying to embarrass you publicly, the universe was training you privately. They thought they were taking from you, but they were sculpting the future ruler of their own downfall. You became observant instead of emotional, grounded instead of reactive. That's the mark of your real heritage. You don't collapse under pressure. You compress into diamonds. You didn't just survive what they did, you turned it into armor. And now that you're untouchable, they wonder how you did it. They think it's luck, divine protection, or coincidence. But it's inheritance. The ones before you already coded resilience into your soul. You simply activated it when everything around you went silent. They can't manipulate someone who doesn't need acceptance. You reached that stage. Your energy no longer bends to guilt, flattery, or fear. That's when your bloodline truly wakes up, when you stop needing applause. You learn to read intention instead of listening to words. You started watching how people move when they think you aren't looking. You realize leadership is not about command. It's about emotional mastery. The moment you took control of your emotions, you inherited the throne your ancestors prepared for you. Not a throne made of gold, but one made of awareness. They wanted to play chess, you built the board. That quiet shift made you dangerous, because the world runs on emotion, and you are one of the few who can stand still in the storm. When they sense you now, they don't understand what changed. They still see the same face, but they feel something else, something sovereign. Your silence carries authority. Your restraint feels like judgment. Your eyes no longer plead, they evaluate. You don't chase closure, because you already understand every ending before it begins. They can't connect with you the same way, because you stopped existing on the level of need. You exist on the level of truth now. That is the evolution of your bloodline. It doesn't chase, it attracts. It doesn't demand, it defines. People now approach you carefully, as if you've become unpredictable. They don't realize that you've always been this way. They're just now seeing the version that stopped hiding. The funny thing about hidden royalty is that it never needs validation to reveal itself. You didn't need to prove your worth. You simply embodied it until they had to notice. The revelation of your bloodline isn't a confession, it's a consequence. You outgrew every limitation they tried to build around you. You stopped explaining your silence and let your actions speak with finality. They wanted you to doubt your origin so they could control your destiny. But you remembered. You remembered the resilience you come from, the patience you were molded with, the divine sense of timing that runs through your veins. That remembrance alone shifted your reality. Because once you know who you are, no illusion can touch you. They passed it down like inheritance. Pain disguised as love, silence dressed as loyalty, control framed as protection. You were born into patterns older than your own name, carrying emotions that weren't entirely yours. The anger, the guilt, the fear. They didn't start with you. They were taught, modeled, repeated. Every family has ghosts, but your bloodline perfected how to live with them. You saw how they smiled at gatherings, pretending history had no sharp edges. But you felt it. The tension that filled the air like smoke. The unspoken rules about what can and cannot be said. They thought you'd adapt like the rest, nod along, keep the silence alive. But something in you refused. You stopped accepting pain as tradition. You looked the monster in the eye and said, "It ends here." They call that rebellion, but it's not. It's cleansing. It's someone finally daring to face what generations have avoided. You were never the favorite, but you were the one chosen by circumstance. Pain selects its challenger carefully. It looks for the one who can feel deeply without drowning, who can analyze hurt without becoming it. You were built for this confrontation long before you understood it. They tried to teach you denial, because denial keeps the family structure intact. You learned observation instead. You saw how they justified cruelty as discipline. You saw how they excused betrayal as sacrifice, and you refused to accept those distortions as truth. That refusal was your rebellion, quiet but irreversible. They feared you, not because you were disrespectful, but because you started naming things they spent decades avoiding. When you confront trauma, you expose the architecture of illusion that holds a family together. And the moment truth enters, comfort dies. You weren't destroying your lineage, you were saving it from its own decay. They called you ungrateful because you didn't worship the dysfunction that raised you. They said you were cold because you stopped excusing harm. They said you were different because you stopped pretending everything was fine. What they didn't realize was that someone had to break the rhythm before it broke everyone else. You were the one who saw the cycles clearly, how silence birthed resentment, how guilt replaced accountability, how love became a negotiation. And you refused to pass that down. You were tired of watching people call suffering normal. Healing made you dangerous because it stripped the family's favorite currency, guilt, of its power. When you stopped responding to it, the system cracked. Every manipulator who thrived on that energy began to lose control. You didn't just break the pattern. You rewrote the definition of love in a language they could no longer understand. Healing makes you an outsider at first. They start whispering that you've changed, that you think you're better than them. They confuse clarity with arrogance. But truth always looks offensive to those who built their comfort on lies. You stopped engaging in their emotional theater. You stopped apologizing for wanting peace. You no longer participated in conversations that revolved around blame instead of responsibility. That distance they accuse you of creating wasn't pride. It was survival. Because once you confront the root, you can no longer sit in the soil that grew it. The one who heals becomes the villain in the story told by the unhealed. That's the cost of transformation. But it's a cost worth paying. Because while they stay repeating history, you begin writing a future where no one has to inherit the same pain again. That is how bloodlines evolve, through one person's courage to outgrow the silence. You began noticing how pain disguises itself in the smallest things, in how someone avoids eye contact after conflict, in how affection comes with conditions, in how apologies sound more like negotiations. You saw that trauma doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers through habits, through tone, through what is never said aloud. That awareness turned you into the observer, the one who sees what others pretend not to. But awareness is responsibility. Once you see, you can't unsee. You started holding people accountable, starting with yourself. You stopped romanticizing struggle, stopped normalizing dysfunction, stopped pretending control equals love. And every time you stood firm, the air changed. You didn't just heal, you disrupted the entire emotional ecosystem of your bloodline. They can't go back to pretending anymore. Even if they reject your truth, it lingers. That's the paradox of healing. It makes denial impossible for those who witness it. You learn that confronting trauma isn't just about understanding pain. It's about releasing the identity it created. You stop defining yourself by wounds that weren't yours to begin with. The anger you carried wasn't inherited strength, it was recycled defense. The guilt you felt wasn't moral awareness, it was emotional blackmail. The need to fix everyone wasn't compassion, it was survival. Once you understood that, you detached. You gave every emotion back to its rightful owner. You refused to carry pain that didn't belong to you. That act of separation broke generations of emotional debt. They saw it as abandonment, but it was liberation. When you heal, you startle the entire lineage because healing removes their excuse. You prove that pain can be processed, not performed. You show that silence can be replaced by truth, not tension. And that example forces even the most stubborn hearts to reconsider their own patterns. They wanted you to inherit shame, but you inherited awareness instead. They wanted you to repeat their fears, but you rewired your instincts. They wanted you to keep the family's secrets buried, but you dug them out, examined them, and set them on fire. You became what they feared most, a reflection they couldn't manipulate. Because you didn't attack them, you revealed them. You didn't curse your lineage, you purified it. That is the villain's role in every story, the one who challenges false peace. You carried centuries of silence on your back and turned it into language. Every conversation you refused to avoid became a weapon. Every truth you spoke aloud became a spell that loosened the grip of generational pain. You didn't heal by accident. You were chosen by necessity. You were the first in your line to say, "No more." And that sentence was more revolutionary than they will ever admit. You became fluent in contradiction. You loved them, but you couldn't stay blind. You respected them, but you couldn't enable them. You forgave them, but you refused to forget. Healing doesn't mean separation from people. It means separation from patterns. You learn to love without losing yourself. You stopped trying to fix what was never your fault. That boundary wasn't cruelty, it was clarity. They'll say you became cold, but it's not coldness, it's temperature control. You learned how to regulate emotion instead of drowning in it. The trauma that used to define your responses now fuels your insight. You see manipulation before it forms. You sense avoidance before it spreads. You can predict their behavior not because you judge them, but because you've studied pain's mechanics for a lifetime. You no longer operate from inheritance. You operate from intention. That shift marks the beginning of generational rebirth. They may never thank you for what you did. Healing rarely gets applause. It gets resistance, denial, exile. But one day a child in your bloodline will feel the difference. They'll grow up without the same anxiety, without the same fear of speaking truth, without the same habit of mistaking guilt for love. They'll move freely in ways you couldn't, and that freedom will trace back to you. You became the interruption, the storm that ended an endless loop. They'll never understand how much it cost you to stop the inheritance of pain, but they'll live in the peace you created. That is legacy. That is what bravery looks like, not revenge, not perfection, but restoration. You didn't break your family. You saved the parts worth saving and released the rest to the fire. And in doing so, you built a lineage worth continuing. They didn't forget your name. They buried it. The silence around it was not ignorance, it was strategy. They wanted to erase what couldn't be controlled. You were too sharp, too aware, too unpredictable. They realized early that attention is energy and silence is starvation. So they starved you of it, thinking invisibility would tame you. But silence doesn't weaken those who know themselves. It sharpens them. While they were busy making noise for validation, you were learning to breathe in obscurity. You studied every pattern, every motive, every hypocrisy. They wanted you silent so they could remain loud. They wanted your absence to echo their importance. But what they didn't understand is that real power doesn't need to be seen. It only needs to exist. The silence around your name was never emptiness. It was concealment. You weren't forgotten. You were hidden by fate until the noise destroyed itself. They feared mentioning you, because mentioning you meant acknowledging their guilt. The ones who pretended not to see you knew exactly what they were doing. They avoided saying your name because it reminded them of what they tried to bury. The truth, the mistake, the betrayal. You became a mirror they couldn't face. So they used silence as armor, hoping time would erase the evidence. They didn't know that silence preserves truth. It doesn't destroy it. Every unspoken word became a seed planted in time. You grew in their denial. They thought they were protecting their narrative, but they were preparing your arrival. When the world finally turns toward you, they'll realize that their silence was your soil. Everything they tried to withhold became fertilizer for your rise. You didn't need their voice. You needed their absence to build your own. They conspired without speaking because the intention was clear. You were not meant to be erased. You were meant to be delayed. They understood the danger of early recognition. If people saw your power too soon, it would shift the order. So they covered your name in fog, whispering half-truths, steering attention away. But time is cruel to those who manipulate it. While they spoke of themselves, you transformed. While they celebrated illusions, you built substance. Now, when your name resurfaces, it carries the gravity of everything they tried to deny. Silence has weight, and yours was heavy enough to command respect. They can't reduce what they ignored. They can only watch it arrive. The very silence they used to suppress you now becomes the proof of how long you've been underestimated. The reveal is poetic, because nothing sounds louder than a name once buried and resurrected in truth. They thought your disappearance meant defeat. But disappearance is the tactic of the patient, not the broken. You learned the art of invisibility, not as surrender, but as strategy. You withdrew from noise so you could move without resistance. You understood that exposure too early leads to destruction. You watched them chase recognition like addicts, draining their credibility for applause. You chose silence because you were building something that required secrecy. That difference separates leaders from followers. They live for visibility, you live for impact. They didn't understand that silence is not a void, it's a forge. While they filled the air with words, you filled your time with precision. When you reappear, it will not be as a participant. It will be as a force. They won't remember silencing you. They'll remember being unprepared for what your silence created. There was a time you doubted it. You thought the silence meant you were forgotten, overlooked, irrelevant. You mistook rejection for injustice, and maybe it was. But in hindsight, you see it differently. You realize silence was your training ground. It forced you inward. It refined your vision, stripped you of dependence, built resilience that fame could never teach. They say isolation breaks people, but you were never ordinary enough to break. You learned how to exist without validation, how to function without acknowledgement, how to believe without witness. That independence became your weapon. They thought silence would weaken your name. It gave it mystery instead. Now your name holds weight not because it was shouted, but because it survived without being spoken. There's something terrifying about a name that thrives in silence. It means its power comes from source, not spectators. They avoided saying your name because power transfers through acknowledgement. They couldn't bear to give you energy, even accidentally. Every time they wanted to reference you, they paused. Every conversation about you came with hesitation, deflection, a quick change of subject. You became taboo, too dangerous to discuss, too unpredictable to dismiss. They thought their silence would erase you from memory. Instead, it made you myth. People started wondering why your name was never mentioned, why your story was half told, why your presence always lingered in absence. And that curiosity grew louder than their silence. They thought withholding recognition would bury you, but it only created intrigue. You became the story people whispered about. They removed your voice and accidentally gave you legend. Silence doesn't erase truth, it amplifies it in time's echo. Now when they finally say your name, it will sound like a confession. They thought legacy was a gift wrapped in gold, passed down like a reward for obedience. They believed it was about possessions, titles, or bloodlines that stretched across history. But legacy was never about what they handed down, it was about what you took back. Legacy is not inheritance, it's reclamation. It's the art of reclaiming what was stolen through fierce silence and complacency. You weren't born to receive, you were born to restore. They left you fragments of dreams they were too afraid to chase, and you turned them into blueprints. They handed you patterns of survival, and you transformed them into creation. They gave you half-truths to keep you controlled, and you reshaped them into understanding. That's what terrifies them. You didn't accept their version of legacy. You redefined it. You stopped being the continuation of their story and became the author of a new one written in fire instead of ink. They worked to pass on comfort. You chose to pass on consciousness. They collected wealth but lost wisdom along the way. You saw that what they called success was often a well-decorated cage. You realized inheritance is temporary. It can be spent, stolen, lost. But reclamation, it cannot be taken. It's internal. It's the process of remembering who you were before conditioning turned your mind into a museum of other people's beliefs. They built their legacy on protection, but you built yours on truth. They wanted you safe. You wanted to be free. They wanted you to maintain their image. You wanted to reclaim your identity. That difference made you dangerous. Because reclaiming doesn't ask permission. It takes back what was buried. It reaches into history, digs through silence, and unearths what was meant to be forgotten. They see you doing it now and whisper that you've changed. But you haven't. You've returned. You saw how people cling to inheritance because it's easy. It demands nothing but acceptance. But reclamation is violent in its honesty. It demands awareness, sacrifice, confrontation. You can't reclaim your power without destroying what distorted it. That's why they resist your growth. You threaten the structure that kept them comfortable. They want you to inherit their habits, not challenge their history. But you learn that respect without truth is submission. So you burn the illusions they passed down, the fear of failure, the addiction to approval, the habit of self-erasure. You didn't do it out of spite. You did it out of necessity. Because legacy built on lies collapses with time. You're building something that doesn't require defense. You're reclaiming depth where they chased appearances, reclaiming silence as strength, reclaiming pain as purpose. Every move you make redefines what it means to belong to your bloodline. You're no longer an heir. You're the architect. They wanted to teach you preservation, but you chose transformation. They told you to protect what exists, but you decided to resurrect what was lost. You realized the true inheritance wasn't their wealth or their wisdom, it was their wounds. Every generation passes down both. The difference is choice. You chose to reclaim the parts they abandoned, the dreams they killed for acceptance, the voices they silenced for peace, the integrity they sacrificed for status. You took what they hid and gave it breath again. That's what reclamation looks like.